Robin Harding, Bureau Chief for the Financial Times, I'm chairing today. It's great to see such a good turnout at such short notice. It's a real pity we won't be able to finalise this until the last moment. Otherwise, I'm sure the room would be absolutely full, given the interest of the topic, US-Japan trade relations more generally, given what we know are the very important upcoming trade in goods talks between the US and Japan, which haven't started yet because it seems like the Chinese talks are going to go on and on, but we all expect that to happen sometime this year. Our guest today, I'm very honoured to introduce Christopher LaFleur, chairman of the ACCJ, and a former diplomat here in Tokyo, ultimately the deputy chief of mission at the US Embassy, following which he became ambassador to Malaysia before leaving US government service and taking on various positions in business. As head of the ACCJ, I think he's more qualified than almost anybody to talk about what US business will be looking for in these trade talks and whether the interests of the Trump administration happen to align with the interests of US business or not. I'd like to turn it over to Ambassador LaFleur to give some brief introductory remarks, and then since we have relatively small numbers today, we'll keep it informal and just take questions in a flowing way rather than do this under formal press conference rules. So Ambassador LaFleur, please.
Great. Well, thank you very much, including for that kind introduction. I guess first things first, I should clarify that that's Ambassador retired. I'm no longer in the U.S. government, so just want to make sure that's evident from the beginning. I'd also like to take on one point of terminology with respect to the forthcoming U.S.-Japan trade talks. Of course, as you've correctly noted, Robin, that those have not yet officially started. But when the two heads of government of the U.S. and Japan met in September, President Trump and Prime Minister Abe, and issued their joint announcement on these negotiations. If you look at the text, it's clear that the subjects that were identified for these talks were going to be goods and services and other issues. And I think in the, at least one of the Japanese translations I've seen of that announcement, the acronym TAG, T-A-G, was inserted. Which sounds as though the negotiations are about goods. But if you look, in fact, at what the joint statement actually reads, it doesn't use that acronym, and it doesn't capitalize the G in goods. And so, in fact, the talks are to be about goods and services and other issues. And that's an important point, I think, to make because in terms of U.S.-Japan trade, services, although not quite as large a component in the two-way trade, is definitely a very large one, and one in which, from an American point of view, I'm happy to say the U.S. enjoys a healthy surplus in the bilateral balance of trade. So we feel at the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan that services should very much be one of the priority sets of issues in this negotiation. And we look forward to a good ultimate agreement that will cover the entire range of issues that are important to the U.S. and Japanese economies. Let me also say that next week, the American Chamber is sending a delegation of CEO-level officials, CEO-level executives, rather, from U.S.-based companies to Washington to talk about these issues with officials in the U.S. government, as well as members of Congress on the Hill and other organizations in Washington. And we look forward in those talks in those meetings to outlining for those we're speaking with the range of U.S. business interests in Japan, the importance of Japan to the success of many American companies, and our high expectation that these negotiations are going to produce an agreement from which both countries will benefit and which will serve to strengthen the extremely important relationship between our two countries. So with those introductory remarks, I'd be delighted to respond to any issues or questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Let me start off with one question. It's very clear from the way the Japanese government has presented it that they regard this as being largely a trade agreement in goods. Whereas when you listen to US officials talk about it, they clearly see this as a much broader free trade conversation and potential deal. So are these talks doomed from the start by a huge gulf between the two parties, or is this only presentational and in reality the two sides agree what they're going to talk about?
Well, certainly in some of the presentations that you read here in Japan that are sourced to folks in the Japanese government, you do get the impression that the focus indeed is on goods. But every time that I or other people in the ACCJ have talked with Japanese government officials about this, they've been reassuring about the services also being a topic of discussion in these negotiations. So no, I don't think we feel any particular anxiety on that point. We simply want to ensure that both sides recognize that services are not only a key area for bilateral negotiation, but also, if you look to the future, most likely the fields in which our two economies are going to be growing most rapidly. And if you look at it from that perspective, having a discussion on services as we try to design a new trade agreement aimed at the future, services really become a critical element of a successful bilateral agreement.
Okay, so we'll open it up to questions. The usual ground rules, so regular members first, state your name and affiliation before asking your question. So Anthony Rowley.
Thank you. Anthony Rowley, freelance. Two questions, if I may. I assume that automobile trade is going to figure quite largely in this negotiation. And when Clyde Prestovitz was in this room quite recently, he said that Japan was quite nervous that the US would try to insist on some sort of quotas on automobiles. Whether these will be export quotas or import quotas, I'm not quite sure, but I'd like to hear your view on that. And secondly, he also suggested there could be a currency element in this. In other words, if the US pushes China, for instance, for an undertaking not to manipulate the yuan, that he may push Japan similarly for concession on the yen, or rather for an agreement on the yen.
Well, I won't try to project what Japanese might be feeling about autos as an issue in the negotiations. I'll let them speak for themselves on that score. But as far as we go at the American Chamber, we do have, in fact, two of the big three automobile companies represented in our chamber, as well as other companies that are involved in the manufacturing of automobiles. And so we are, of course, sensitive to the importance of that issue and of trying to make some progress. And we hope of increasing the opportunities in the United States for expanding manufacture of automobiles. As everyone who has followed this industry, whether in the United States or in Japan, it's evident that the market is changing rapidly, that new technologies are being introduced that clearly are going to have a significant impact on the future of the automobile business. And so one of our hopes is that this negotiation can do a couple of things. One would be to, as much as possible, harmonize the regulations that governments impose on manufacturers to meet certain standards with respect to safety, emissions, et cetera. Broadly speaking, those standards are perhaps not fundamentally different between the two countries, but they're different enough so that someone manufacturing an automobile in America would have great difficulty marketing that automobile in Japan without substantial additional cost to modify the vehicle. So harmonization of those standards between the two markets go a long way, I think, to presenting American-made automobiles with a level playing field in Japan. And frankly, that's a playing field that any company might benefit from. Even Japanese companies producing autos in the United States potentially could benefit from such a thing. But that would have certainly create larger opportunities for Americans to work in the automobile industry back home. And so from that perspective, that would be a very positive development. Moving beyond that, though, both countries are looking from a regulatory point of view at what the guidelines and ultimately regulations need to be to govern some of these new technologies that are being introduced into automobile manufacturing. That includes, of course, the driverless vehicle technologies that are going to be very important. It includes the new engine technologies, electric and hybrid, et cetera, that are clearly going to be the wave of the future. So the more this agreement can harmonize the standards and government policies with respect to such vehicles, again, more level the playing field for the future could be, and more opportunities, rather, for cooperation between companies in both economies would be created. And so we'd like to see the two governments focus on that issue as well. We really don't have a position on currency issues at the U.S. Chamber. We're going to leave that topic to the governments to sort out.
Sorry, what I meant was, do you think these things will figure in the debate? One, quotas on autos, and two, currencies. Sorry, that's what I was really...
Yeah, I don't think I can speak for the governments to say what will be in the dialogue. I think those are the elements we would like to see from a business perspective in the dialogue.
So just to be clear, on the autos, regulatory harmonisation is the extent of what you're looking for, or do things like quotas enter into the discussion?
We haven't urged that quotas be established, no.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Isabel.
Isabel Reynolds from Bloomberg. I'm sorry. I'm very struck by the difference in tone between what you're saying and what President Trump is saying. He seems to be calling for balanced trade, and what he's asking for seems to be basically taking from Japan, getting more ground from Japan, and not necessarily expecting to give anything in return. You're talking about win-win. Which is it actually going to be?
Well, I think it should be and can be win-win because this agreement will create, hopefully will lead to an agreement which will harmonize standards between the two countries in a variety of areas, and by doing so will create fresh opportunities for businesses in both countries. For one area, to point to a specific example where the United States has been very successful in recent years in the Japanese economy operating in Japan, has been in the IT sector. and the internet-based businesses that have come to Japan from the United States have in many cases done very well, have introduced fresh ways of doing business to the Japan market, and stimulated growth here as well, of course, as providing important business opportunities for Americans both here and back in the United States. So we see an expanding set of opportunities that can be created by this agreement going forward. So again, I don't see this as America taking and Japan giving. I see this as an opportunity for the two countries to work together to expand their economies and hopefully create additional higher standards in some areas that will encourage other economies and other agreements that are being negotiated or already exist to try to match those higher standards.
You want to follow up, Isabel? So what are the wins for Japan? What are the potential wins for Japan?
So the opportunity for Japan, I think, includes creating a stronger set of rules around what is going to be permissible and what is going to be encouraged by governments in the digital services and digital trading area. Clearly, we've come a long way since the IT revolution really kicked in the late 1990s, early 2000s. We've seen development of some extraordinarily creative and innovative and effective business models. Whether you look at the cellular telephone market, not very long ago, in fact, just about 10 years ago, the famous Galapagos phones were still dominating the market here. For telephone, for mobile telephones. And today you're seeing the tremendous growth of technologies that have their origin outside of Japan, but have clearly revolutionized the market here and created a lot of new business opportunities for Japanese companies. Some of the gaming companies that you have online today certainly would not exist without having that kind of, if you will, indirect collaboration with companies coming from overseas. I don't imagine that a company like Line, for example, would have had the success it's had in Japan without those technologies being introduced here. Again, this can be, I think, a win-win opportunity for both countries if we can maintain or develop as much as possible the level playing fields where creative companies from both countries can have the greatest possible range of opportunities to compete, and we'll see who can do the best there. I think Americans have demonstrated that when given those opportunities, we can do well, can do very well indeed in some cases. And from a viewpoint of our chamber, we have a lot of members who have done and are doing a very important share of their global company's business here in Japan, and we want to see that opportunity further extended. Having said that, the digital economy also is creating some new issues around, for instance, cyber security issues. The more the two governments can work together to better reassure our citizens and our consumers in this economy that the digital space is a safe one in which to operate and do business in, and buy products in, and buy services in, the greater the opportunity will be for this sector to continue to grow in both countries. So again, this agreement, we hope, will really pave the way for the two governments to lay out some roadmaps to the future here, which businesses from both countries can take advantage of.
Hans.
Hello, Hans Greimel from Automotive News. I'd like to go back to the auto questions again. Surprise, surprise. So if you are able to create this level playing field, like you say, and address the harmonization of the standards and that you mentioned earlier, how much upside do you think there actually is for U.S. auto industry to make business here in Japan? Where do you see the increase in activity, and how many more cars would they sell? How many more parts could they sell? Is there any quantification that the Chamber has done on that question?
Yeah, we're not in the position to quantify, market opportunities for the industry. Probably your publication would be better at it than we would. But I think clearly this is going to be a challenging market for all auto producers going forward. The demographics are pretty clear on that score. I don't think that the sales in Japan for either country's manufacturers are going up at the moment. Certainly not very substantially, and I don't think we could expect that traditional technologies will continue to produce greater numbers in that respect either. So that's why I think, from our point of view, we ought to be trying to, or should be asking the two governments to try to expand the range of opportunities oriented more toward the future. Clearly, it's hard to predict what numbers are going to be coming out of that sort of cooperation. Simply, in no small part because it's very hard to predict which technologies are going to be successful. No one still, is quite clear on what driverless vehicles are going to look like going forward, even though pretty much everyone expects to see them in the not too distant future on the roads. Japan will clearly be one of the markets where driverless technology has a high probability of success, given the very concentrated urban areas and well mapped out routes across the country. So this is an area where there should be a lot of opportunity, and hopefully opportunity for not only Japanese manufacturers but also American manufacturers. Hence, we, again, are hoping that this agreement will pave the way for some common standards for this sort of technology. Clearly, the governments are going to be getting involved in determining what level of automation is going to be permitted, what sort of government regulations and licenses are going to be permitted, the question of what the passengers and/or drivers in a vehicle like that are responsible for, who takes care of insurance issues. There are a lot of things that are going to get sorted out that government regulation is certainly going to be a part of. And so the more, again, the two governments can establish some rules of the road that would govern both countries, hopefully to the highest degree possible in a similar manner, to that degree the playing field will be level and American companies will hopefully have more opportunities.
Is it fair to say then that the Chamber or the U.S. auto industry based here in Japan has kind of abandoned the idea of increasing auto sales here and is looking more towards next generation technologies instead?
No, I think the industry will continue to pursue opportunities here to sell in Japan. If you drive down the streets of Tokyo, you'll see quite a few Jeeps here. I understand it's the #9 best-selling foreign automobile in Japan. And clearly that sort of represents a certain lifestyle choice among consumers that I think conveys a sense of perhaps what kinds of opportunities might be open here to not only Fiat Chrysler but also other companies. But no, I think certainly American companies want to continue to compete here and hopefully win as much market share as possible. But again, as I said earlier, pretty much all automobile companies are going to be challenged in this market, given the demographics. So I think looking to the future also makes very good sense.
Thank you. Okay. Any more questions? Any more questions from regular members? Yuko.
Yuko Takeo from Bloomberg News. Sorry, I want to go back to the currency clause question. Would you say that its inclusion would be a positive for your member companies at all?
Well, perhaps individual companies might have a view on that, but I think as a chamber, we really haven't taken a position on that sort of issue. That really sort of rises to a different level of discussion, and one that, as businesses, we don't feel that we should be engaged in directly.
So, gentleman here.
Tokumoto freelance for Japanese weekly magazine. Next month, Japanese Emperor Akihito will abdicate, marking the end of the Imperial Heisei period. And from the viewpoint of the ACCJ and foreign business community, how do you observe the Heisei era from 1989 to 2019? Was it a good period or a bad period for foreign business community in Japan? That's my first question. And second question is, Emperor Akihito and Empress Michiko, when they visited foreign countries, they paid their respect to war dead, not only Japanese, but also Koreans and American soldiers. And I think it sent a very strong message to the rest of the world. And do you think that their activities in the past 30 years had any good feedback to the business environment from your perspective?
Well, clearly during the Heisei era, there have been a series of ups and downs from a business perspective. But I think if you look at the entire period overall, that you would see that the conditions for business, and that certainly includes U.S. business, in Japan have improved rather significantly. And of course, that might be somewhat counterintuitive, given that a substantial number of those years were years in which the economy was in deflation, and Japan struggled to find the right policies to reignite Japanese growth economically. But as we sit here today, I believe we are essentially in the longest period of continuously sustained growth on an annual basis that Japan has had since World War II. And although the percentage year on year of that growth clearly is not as impressive as the growth Japan experienced in the 1950s or 60s, when you consider that Japan is already the third largest economy and certainly one of the wealthiest societies in the world, even that growth is quite a substantial achievement. And you see the impact of that all around us here in Tokyo. Take just in our immediate surroundings, any of you who were around here not so long ago will recall that this entire area of Marunouchi was filled with buildings that were increasingly elderly. And in the space of roughly 20 years, almost all of them have been replaced, or a very substantial number anyway, have been replaced by much larger and better equipped and more energy efficient buildings and more comfortable buildings than the ones that preceded them. So clearly there has been a very substantial improvement in the quality of life in Japan, at least in most of its major cities. Now, obviously, there are challenges out in the countryside that are associated with the aging population and other challenges related to it. And I don't want for a minute to ignore the challenge that represents. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that in Japan today, you have one of the most comfortable societies that people can enjoy anywhere in the world. And that certainly is a fruit of the efforts that the Japanese people and its leadership have made during the Heisei era. And I think I probably should leave my response at that. Well, certainly we have only the highest respect for the emperor and for the efforts that he and the empress have made over the Heisei era to extend the hand of friendship and expand the warm feelings and relationships between certainly the United States and Japan and other countries as well. So we have absolutely the highest respect for what they've accomplished.
Anthony.
A tremendous amount of work was done on harmonization of standards and so on within the context of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which is now called the CPTPP. Of course, Mr. Trump pulled Japan out of that negotiation, and Japan subsequently rescued the negotiations and the CPTPP sort of back on the road. But that was a multilateral negotiation. Now you are having a bilateral negotiation. I wonder how these two things can be squared. I mean, for example, has Japan given commitments to the TPP partners which will limit what it can do with the United States now? And I mean, to what extent are these two things likely to be create friction?
Well, hopefully, rather than creating friction, the hard work that was put into negotiating the TPP on a bilateral basis can help inform the discussions that are going to take place now between the two countries. After all, TPP, of course, was indeed and is in its current form a multilateral trade agreement. But that agreement also required very substantial bilateral negotiation between each of the members. So there has been some groundwork already laid between the two countries on some of these issues, including those that ultimately were included in the TPP. Since the agreement was negotiated, there have been other negotiations, including between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico that have taken place that have probably addressed issues that weren't fully covered in TPP. There are other issues that we would like to see included that wouldn't have been included in TPP. Some of those are really more bilateral in nature in their origin. So actually, even while TPP was negotiating, our chamber had called for a new bilateral channel for discussion as well, which we felt should be taking place at the same time and should address issues that TPP as a multilateral dialogue wouldn't have been equipped to address. One of those currently very much on our minds is in the area of health sciences, medicines, medical devices, pharmaceuticals. This is an area where Japan is introducing new policies that clearly are going to have a negative effect on U.S. exports to Japan in these fields. And this is an area that might not have been appropriate for discussion in TPP, but we feel are very much appropriate for a bilateral dialogue. And so I think there's opportunity here to move forward on a bilateral basis to have an agreement that will cover both issues that were taken up in TPP, but also issues that should be bilateral.
Gentleman in the middle there.
Thank you, Ryotaro Sato from Nikkei. When you say that the service is one of the priorities in the next talks, can you specify some of the areas that you have in mind in the services and some of the specific regulations that you have in mind that want to be discussed in these talks? And one more question that the Japanese government have commented on some time that the level of market openness to be discussed in these talks should be at the highest the level of TPP and EPA between the European Union. Do you think these levels are satisfiable to the Chamber of Commerce? Thank you.
Well, on the services side, I probably should point you first off, and any of the rest of you who might be interested, at testimony that the Chamber presented to the U.S. Trade Representative's office in December. I went to Washington and attended a hearing where I presented on that to U.S. government officials. And that document will lay out in much greater detail than I can possibly pull up here today what our particular concerns and suggestions were for these negotiations. But let me flag a couple of areas. Whether it's financial services or other services, data is going to be an absolutely critical issue to be addressed in these talks. For the digital economy that I was talking about earlier, obviously data is the lifeblood of those businesses. And increasingly for financial services, being able to move data freely and handle it in ways that are commercially viable, while at the same time protecting privacy, are absolutely critical to the evolution of their businesses going forward. And increasingly, with the introduction of the Internet of Things, manufactured products are increasingly going to be linked into the Internet, and the data that is emerging from those machines going forward is going to be commercially extraordinarily important to the success of the businesses who create those pieces of equipment. And so on that score, we're very much hoping that the agreement will further and elaborate on the rules the two governments will be establishing now and in the future for the management of data. Several elements go into this, of course. One of those, and a principle we think is extremely critical, is that there be free flow of data permitted across borders. The U.S. and Japan have good policies with respect to this area, but not all governments do. And we feel that it's very important that this government set a high standard by guaranteeing the free flow of data across national borders. As I mentioned earlier, we want to see the two governments also put greater effort into guaranteeing cybersecurity. That's an issue certainly that individual companies and groups of companies need to work on, but the governments, I think, need to help us with that very critical issue as well. In the area of financial services, establishing as much as possible common standards for what the cashless economies of the future are going to look like can be very important. As most of you will appreciate, there are a variety of models for how cashless transactions should be accounted for. And you walk into various stores in Tokyo, you'll see a different array, different kinds of arrays of cashless terminals and other technologies. So clearly the market, in essence, is testing various solutions to what would make a cashless society possible. And from a business perspective, we would like to see the two economies operating under rules that are even-handed, that don't pick winners and losers, and allow the market to determine which technologies are the most successful at meeting consumers' needs in this area. So that's another example of a field in which we think this negotiation can provide a good and effective outcome. Another area which is actually related to both services and goods is in the field of transportation. The current customs limit, I think, for Japanese, for products being imported into Japan is, I believe, 10,000 yen currently. We'd like to see that raised 10 times. So that small packages can be delivered into Japan from overseas locations by businesses, direct to consumers or to other businesses in ways that don't trigger onerous, difficult, and expensive customs duties and regulations and allow packages to flow more quickly and freely across borders. This is going to expand economic opportunities for a variety of companies and choice for consumers, certainly including here in Japan. Another area is in the area of competition. The express delivery services have to compete against a government entity in the Japanese postal system that has certain advantages by regulation over commercial shippers. And we feel that, again, the playing field should be leveled out. And this is another field where we think the negotiation can help us. So there are a variety of things that I've thrown out there. Again, I'll direct you to the full list that we presented to the U.S. Trade Representative's office at the end of last year.
Does that answer your question?
And one more about the level of open markets regarding the Japanese government said level should be at the most EU EPA and TPP. So is that satisfactory, though?
Well, I'm trying to recall specifically the language that was used in the agreement. When you cite that language, what comes to mind immediately is I believe, a reference to agricultural trade, if I'm not entirely mistaken. And certainly, from an American perspective, we would like to see, at minimum, a level playing field restored between exporters to Japan of agricultural products from CP, TPP countries and from EU countries with their American competitors. As a result of the CP, TPP, and the Japan-EU economic cooperation agreement coming into force, effectively, exporters to Japan of agricultural products enjoy fairly significant price advantages now over their American competitors. And we would like to see, at minimum, those differences erased. Now, in principle, we'd like to see all of those barriers eased and the freest trade possible realized between the two countries, including in agriculture. Hope that answers your question.
I'm going to ask one and then Isabel. So my question, Japan didn't want these bilateral talks, and it's entered into them under the duress of potential tariffs on automobiles, a unilateral threat by the US side. And the deal you're describing, to be honest, doesn't sound very attractive to Japan if the best it can hope for is a level playing field on digital, which is a US area of export strength rather than a Japanese area of export strength. So my question is, do you really think this deal is going to happen, given that there doesn't seem to be any reason at all why Japan would agree to it other than to avoid auto tariffs?
Well, I don't know how much money the people who have Pokemon have made out of the U.S., but I'm sure it's been substantial. Well, look, I think, as I said earlier, there's an opportunity here to grow both economies. And if the two governments cooperate in establishing the right rules of the road for our businesses going forward, I think Japan also stands to benefit very substantially. Clearly, in Japan, the economic model is evolving. You're seeing a lot of new companies emerging, a lot of younger people creating new companies, new technologies. And the kind of agreement that we think would be beneficial will be to their benefit as well as to ours. So again, I think there's definitely a win-win opportunity here. We should focus on that going forward. If you look at agricultural products, certainly the broad range of Japanese consumers are going to benefit substantially from having a wider range of product available to them at lower prices, including from foreign suppliers. There Clearly, that creates a greater competitive situation for those involved in Japanese agriculture. But as you look around Japan today, you see that scene changing as well. You're seeing younger people moving into agriculture in some areas. You're seeing companies looking to invest in Japanese agriculture. And you're seeing the Japanese government look at ways to encourage the export of high-quality Japanese agricultural products into overseas markets, including the U.S. So to say that this is all one way, I think, is to miss the broader picture in the economy. There's definitely opportunity for Japan, including in the agricultural area, if people are, will direct the energy and dedication that Japan has shown in so many other areas to innovating in this field as well, and I'm confident it will.
So a deal will definitely happen.
I hesitate to predict anything will definitely happen in the world of diplomacy, having been involved in it. But I think the opportunity is clearly there, and the President and the Prime Minister have laid out a pretty clear course here. It's up to the negotiators now. I've no doubt that there will be challenging issues, but I've got high confidence that both Japan and the U.S. are fielding some very strong teams for those negotiations.
Thank you. Isabel.
I have two questions, actually. Sorry. One, I wanted to ask you for a little bit more detail about what you're looking for in health sciences, medicine, and medical devices. Is it something that Japan would fear in terms of sort of undermining its health system that it's very proud of? Because I'm sure that would be very difficult. But also, I wanted to go back to my first question. From my point of view, what I see is President Trump wants some step towards balanced trade before he goes into his next election. And I don't really think that's going to happen through harmonizing digital regulations or something. He wants something very concrete to happen very quickly. How likely do you think that is?
Well, again, it's hard for me to crystal ball the future here, as we sometimes say in America. But I think even before the administrations of Prime Minister Abe and President Trump, both the United States and Japan had decided they needed to enter into trade agreements, and they did that at the time through the TPP mechanism. So I think to identify all of this as just emanating, suddenly with the new U.S. administration is to ignore some of the trend in recent history here. There's been a need for this for some time. Japan has now free trade agreements in one form or another with a very broad range of countries, but doesn't have an equivalent arrangement with the United States. So I think it makes eminent good sense that the two countries try to negotiate an agreement that will hopefully provide for that very important relationship, some 30% of the global economy. The benefits of agreement on all of these different areas, some of which are indeed included in these multilateral agreements. Whether you go multilateral or bilateral, obviously, is a decision. President Trump has made clear his preference for bilateral. As I said earlier, as far as the ACCJ is concerned, we have wanted a bilateral channel as well. And so we're pleased to see that bilateral discussion moving forward. With respect to the question on pharmaceuticals and medical devices, we at the Chamber, the members of our members rather, who are in those industries, very much recognize that Japan has its own unique medical insurance system, and that system clearly is under some challenge as the population ages and expenses rise. So there's no question that steps need to be taken in order to address the shortfall in that system. But having said that, it's our view that those policy changes need to be made in ways that bring to bear the views and expertise of a broad range of stakeholders in this system, including not only those who are medical professionals and in government, in regulatory positions, but also who are in the industry providing the tools that the medical profession is using, as well as patients and other stakeholders. So a broad dialogue in which information is shared transparently and decisions are made on a scientific basis needs to, from our point of view, needs to be enshrined here going forward. We will, hopefully this negotiation will provide some common understandings on that score. Japan is planning to introduce various assessments of pharmaceutical effectiveness. We want to make sure that, again, the grounds for decisions based on that are science-based and involve a transparent sharing of information so we can all see what the rationale for changes in prices are going to be. Finally, it's, as I said earlier, clear that Japan faces a very serious demographic challenge in its healthcare system. There are a variety of ways to meet that challenge from a fiscal point of view. It's our view that taking a creative or more broad-based approach to these problems is likely to be more effective in the long term at solving Japan's challenges than just going after some individual products with price changes. And I say that for two reasons. One, Japan in recent years had introduced one of the most pro-innovation policies for pharmaceutical products in the world. And as a result of that, new medical treatments were being approved in Japan faster even than in the United States. And companies, pharmaceutical companies, were receiving prices that encouraged them to continue innovation on products, including some products with relatively limited potential patient communities. Japan, I think, as this society ages, is going to need those sorts of innovative technologies even more. And if those technologies are introduced, hopefully patients who are cured or whose conditions improve will be less of a burden financially on the insurance system. So from that point of view, Japan would be well advised to continue trying to encourage innovation in the pharmaceutical and medical devices area. But beyond that, if you just look at the raw numbers, and we could provide you those later, I think, the Japanese prices for pharmaceuticals could be cut quite drastically, and yet that still wouldn't resolve the very significant shortfalls you have from a budgetary perspective. So clearly, at some point, other improvements are going to have to be made. And what we would like to propose is that a better dialogue take place on what the range of opportunities is. We think that our member companies can and should play a role in that dialogue. And we think if those opportunities are created, and we hope this negotiation will, that we'll in fact be able to help Japan deal more effectively with what is obviously a very important social problem.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, and Ambassador LaFleur has to leave at 4 o'clock sharp. So what I'd like to do is take all the remaining questions in the room and then ask him to answer them together. So if you have a question, you raise your hand now. It looks like 2 more questions, so we'll go here and then to Siegfried. Yes.
Mitsuya Goto, a life member of this club and an ex-Nissan executive, as you well know. I turned 90 last Sunday, so I'm very old.
Congratulations.
What I want to say is last year on May 30th, I wrote Donald Trump a letter because I saw on the Twitter that he was concerned about his thinning hair. And so I sent him a bottle of Reap's X5 hair growing liquid made by Taisho Pharmaceutical Company. And in the letter I said, don't impose 25% duties on Japanese cars and steel. And I also said GM, Ford, and Chrysler all retreated from the Japanese market long ago. And the only American car sold in Japan now is Jeep, which is made by Fiat Chrysler. And I also said we could not use U.S. sheet metal, so Nippon Steel gave technical assistance, joint venture with Inland Steel. And sheet metal fit to build Japanese cars in America.
Goto-san, we've got 2 minutes left.
But anyway,
we've got one more question.
What I wanted to ask is, what is the United States going to do with the auto industry? GM is retreating from...
Okay, thank you. And the last question, please.
Siegfried Niedl, freelancer from Germany. I think a negotiation, to make a trade negotiation means to compromise. But I think Mr. Trump is not a man of compromise. He's a man of all or nothing. So what does it mean for the negotiation, for trade negotiation?
All right. Please. All right. So, well, first off, Mr. Goto, I think if you can be the poster person for this hair treatment, I expect that Japan will have great increasing export opportunities in the United States in this field as well. And as far as the automobile trade goes, you know, I'm not in a position to predict what's going to happen to Detroit, but clearly the technologies are changing, and in that time of change, opportunity opens up both for the existing players and for new folks. And those who are nimble enough, and I hope some of those will clearly be American companies, are going to have a fresh opportunity at markets, even if they weren't as successful as they'd hoped in the past. So there's a lot happening now in the new automotive technology field, and I think that Americans have every opportunity to benefit from that. And I would expect Japanese companies will as well. With respect to what the president is looking for in negotiations, I guess I would point you to the fact that actually, under the president's watch, they've just concluded a new successor deal to NAFTA. And indeed, those were very long, and although I have no direct involvement or insight into the process there, I think everything you read suggests that there were many difficult issues on which compromise was required from all sides. But they managed to reach agreement, and the president is in the process of working to convince the Congress to support it. So I think right there you see that indeed there are opportunities for negotiations to succeed even when there are difficult issues to address. No doubt there will be between the U.S. and Japan as well, but I think with some goodwill and some insight into the long-term direction of business in both countries, actually there's excellent prospect to have a very good agreement come out of this, and hopefully relatively soon.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Ambassador LaFleur for that fantastic insight into the views of US business on the upcoming trade negotiations. I hope he will come back once those negotiations are actually happening to give us an update. And as is our custom here, we'd give our speakers a year's honorary membership to the club. So please come and join us in these fantastic new facilities, and encourage all of your member companies to come and join us too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.